People think power changes the world. They're wrong. Sometimes, the person holding the mop does. The first thing I noticed that night wasn't the silence. It was the shine. Marble floors stretched across the lobby like frozen water, polished so perfectly they reflected every crystal chandelier hanging 70 feet above my head. I pushed my cleaning cart through the empty hallway at exactly 11:40 p.m., listening to the soft squeak of its wheels echo against walls lined with paintings worth more than I would earn in 10 lifetimes. My name is Claire Bennett, I'm 26 years old, and I clean places where people like me are never supposed to belong. Most nights I worked downtown office buildings after executives went home. Tonight was different. My supervisor handed me a temporary access badge and told me not to ask questions. Penthouse level. Private client. Finish before sunrise. Don't touch anything you don't have to. That was all she said before disappearing into the freight elevator. The ride to the top took nearly a minute. Long enough for my ears to pop. Long enough for me to wonder what kind of person needed an entire floor cleaned after midnight. When the elevator doors opened, the air felt different. Colder. Quieter. Rich people always talked about luxury like it had a smell. They were wrong. Luxury sounded like silence. No buzzing fluorescent lights. No humming vending machines. Just expensive air conditioning and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. I slipped on my white gloves and started with the hallway. Dust first. Then glass. Then the marble. Simple routine. Predictable. Safe. I liked predictable. Life had taught me that surprises usually arrived carrying unpaid bills or bad news. My father used to say honest work leaves honest footprints. Maybe that's why I always looked down while cleaning, making sure every mark disappeared before I moved on. Halfway across the hallway, my mop stopped. There, just a few inches ahead, was something dark against the white marble. At first I thought it was spilled coffee. Then I knelt beside it. The stain had already begun to dry around the edges. Small. Barely noticeable. Crimson beneath the overhead lights. My stomach tightened. I reached toward it with a cleaning cloth before stopping myself. Something about it didn't belong. Neither did the single black leather glove lying 6 feet away near the conference room entrance. Perfectly tailored. Expensive. One finger slightly bent as though someone had dropped it in a hurry. I stood slowly, my heartbeat louder than the rain outside. Somewhere beyond the closed conference doors, I heard footsteps. Not rushed. Measured. Confident. The kind of footsteps that never apologized for interrupting silence. Every instinct told me to grab my cart and disappear into the elevator before whoever owned this floor noticed me. Instead, I picked up the glove. It felt heavier than it should have. Warm, almost as if it hadn't been there very long. Then the conference room door opened. I looked up before I could stop myself. A man stepped into the hallway wearing a charcoal suit that fit like it had been stitched onto him. Tall. Broad shoulders. Dark hair brushed neatly back. His expression wasn't angry or welcoming. It was unreadable. Behind him stood several men who immediately lowered their eyes the moment he moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed too loudly. The entire hallway seemed to wait for him to decide what happened next. His pale blue eyes dropped to my gloved hand. To the black glove I was holding. Then they slowly lifted to meet mine. I should have looked away. Everyone else did. But somehow, I didn't. I held the glove without realizing how tightly my fingers had closed around it until the leather creaked softly beneath my grip. The man standing across from me never raised his voice. He did not have to. The silence surrounding him carried more weight than shouting ever could. His pale blue eyes studied me with unsettling patience, as though he had already learned everything worth knowing before I had spoken a single word. One of the men behind him stepped forward. "Sir, I can take care of this." The stranger lifted one finger, and the man immediately stopped where he stood. No argument. No hesitation. Just obedience. I had seen managers command respect. I had seen wealthy clients demand attention. This was different. This was the kind of authority that lived inside people instead of around them. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware that I was still holding something that obviously belonged to him. "I think this is yours," I said, extending the glove. He walked toward me with slow, measured steps, the polished soles of his shoes making almost no sound against the marble floor I had spent the last 20 minutes cleaning. When he reached me, he did not take the glove immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted to the white cleaning gloves covering my hands. "You stopped working," he said. His voice was calm, low, carrying the faint rhythm of an Italian family that had lived in America long enough to soften every accent without losing it completely. I glanced toward the stain still waiting on the floor. I was trying to decide whether I should clean that first or report it. One corner of his mouth almost moved. Not a smile. Something smaller. Almost invisible. "And what did you decide?" "I decided that pretending not to notice things usually makes them worse." The hallway became even quieter. Behind him, two men exchanged a brief glance before looking away again. It was only then that I realized I had probably said something I should not have. Most people working jobs like mine learned quickly that survival depended on seeing less, asking less, speaking less. I had never been very good at that. The stranger finally accepted the glove from my hand. His fingers brushed the leather instead of mine, careful enough that the contact felt almost deliberate. "What is your name?" he asked. "Claire Bennett." He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "How long have you worked here, Claire Bennett?" "Tonight is my first time on this floor." "Do you like your work?" The question caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me that before. They asked whether the floors were finished, whether the windows were clean, whether I could stay another hour. They never asked whether I liked any of it. I looked around the hallway, at the spotless marble, the endless windows, the reflections I had spent years learning how to perfect. "Cleaning is honest," I answered. "People leave behind enough messes. Someone has to make the room ready for tomorrow." For the first time, the expression in his eyes shifted. Not softer. More curious. As though I had answered a question he had not expected me to understand. One of the suited men approached carefully. "Mr. DeLuca, the meeting is waiting." So that was his name. Damien DeLuca. The name settled into the room as naturally as the rain outside. He looked toward the conference room but did not move immediately. Instead, he glanced once more at the unfinished stain on the marble. "Leave it," he said quietly. I frowned before I could stop myself. "If I leave it, someone else will have to clean it later." He met my eyes again, and for one brief second, the corner of his mouth lifted into the smallest smile I had ever seen. "Perhaps," he replied. "Or perhaps some things should remind us they happened." Then he turned and walked back toward the conference room while everyone else followed without a word. I stood alone in the silent hallway, staring at the stain that I had just been ordered not to erase, wondering why the most powerful man I had ever met seemed less interested in spotless marble than the woman holding the mop. The conference room doors closed with a whisper that barely disturbed the silence, yet somehow the entire floor felt heavier after Damien DeLuca disappeared behind them. I stood alone beside my cleaning cart, staring at the dark stain that reflected the chandelier above it like a tiny shadow trapped beneath glass. Every instinct I had built over years of working night shifts told me to ignore his order and clean it anyway. Leaving unfinished work felt wrong. It felt like leaving a sentence without a period. I sighed, pushed my cart farther down the hallway, and focused on polishing the endless windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain streamed across the glass in silver ribbons, blurring thousands of city lights into one endless river of gold. Somewhere below, people hurried home, ordered late dinners, laughed inside warm apartments, completely unaware that the top floor of this building seemed to exist under different rules. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the conference room door opened again. Men in tailored suits stepped into the hallway one after another. None of them smiled. None of them spoke above a whisper. They simply nodded respectfully toward Damien before disappearing toward the elevators. He remained behind, standing alone beside the long conference table visible through the open doorway. I tried to look away. Instead, I noticed abandoned coffee cups, scattered folders, and water rings staining the polished walnut surface. Whoever those important men were, not one of them had bothered to clean up after themselves. I grabbed a fresh microfiber cloth and quietly rolled my card inside. Damien looked up from the city skyline beyond the windows. "I thought I told you to leave the hallway." "You did," I answered while collecting empty cups. "You never said anything about this room." He watched me straighten misplaced chairs before speaking again. "Someone else could do that tomorrow." I smiled faintly without looking up. Someone else always can. That is usually how people convince themselves not to do the right thing today. The room fell silent again. I wiped a coffee ring from the table with slow circles until the wood reflected the ceiling lights once more. Then I noticed a heavy crystal glass sitting dangerously close to the edge. One careless movement from the next person walking in would send it crashing onto the marble floor. I moved it toward the center of the table. "You notice everything," Damien said quietly. "It is difficult not to when cleaning is your job. Most people only notice what affects them." I shrugged. Most people are too busy being important. That earned something I had not expected. A soft laugh. Brief. Genuine. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, but it changed the entire room. For 1 second he looked less like the untouchable man everyone feared and more like someone who had simply forgotten how to relax. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. I folded the cloth neatly before answering. "Yes." "Does it make you nervous?" I finally met his eyes. "No." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Why not?" I considered the question carefully. "Because marble does not care who walks across it. It gets dirty either way." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to wonder whether I had crossed a line. Then Damien slowly looked around the spotless conference room before returning his gaze to me. "Everyone in this building spends their time trying to impress me," he said. "You are the first person who has ever compared me to a dirty floor." Heat rushed into my face. "That was not exactly what I meant." "I know." His voice carried no anger, only quiet amusement. "That is why I find it interesting." Before I could answer, the elevator chimed at the end of the hallway. Another group of suited men stepped out, their footsteps quickening the moment they saw Damien standing beside the conference room entrance. They immediately lowered their voices and waited for instructions. I watched the transformation happen in seconds. The smile vanished from his face. His posture straightened. The warmth disappeared behind the same unreadable expression I had seen earlier that night. It was as though the man who had laughed no longer existed. As he turned to leave with them, he paused only long enough to glance back at me and say 5 quiet words that stayed with me long after sunrise. "Finish your work, Claire Bennett." By the time the clock above the service elevator read 2:15 in the morning, the rain had finally softened into a gentle rhythm against the windows, but sleep still felt 1,000 miles away. I finished polishing the last conference chair, returned every folder to perfect alignment, and wheeled my cart toward the hallway where the small crimson stain still waited on the marble exactly as Damien had left it. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Every clean floor deserved a proper ending, yet that tiny imperfection seemed to carry a meaning I could not understand. I decided to leave it alone. If the owner of the building wanted one mark to remain, perhaps it belonged there more than I did. As I emptied the trash bins outside the executive offices, I noticed something unusual. A young assistant hurried out of an office carrying a stack of papers so high she could barely see over them. One folder slipped from the pile, scattering documents across the polished floor. Before she could kneel, 3 men in expensive suits walked past without slowing down. One stepped directly over the papers. Another barely glanced at her. The third sighed impatiently as though her existence had interrupted his schedule. I parked my cart and immediately crouched beside her. "I have got these," I said, gathering the pages before the air conditioning could scatter them farther down the hallway. "Thank you," she whispered, her cheeks turning pink with embarrassment. "Everybody is always in such a hurry up here. Maybe they forget paper falls at the same speed no matter how important they are," I replied with a small smile. She laughed quietly, the sound disappearing almost as quickly as it arrived. Neither of us realized someone had been watching until a familiar voice broke the silence behind us. "Interesting philosophy." I stood and turned. Damien stood several feet away with his hands resting inside the pockets of his tailored overcoat. He must have dismissed the rest of his staff because for the first time that night he was completely alone. The assistant immediately lowered her head. "Good evening, Mr. DeLuca." He acknowledged her with a slight nod before looking at me instead. "You interrupted your work to help." I glanced toward my unattended cart. The floor was not going anywhere. His eyes shifted briefly toward the assistant, who now clutched the recovered papers against her chest. "You may go home," he told her. Relief washed across her face. She thanked him twice before hurrying toward the elevators. When the doors closed, the hallway returned to its familiar silence. Damien continued watching the empty space where she had stood. "Do you know why she was afraid?" he asked. "Because you are her boss?" "No." His answer came almost immediately. "She was afraid of making a mistake." I rested both hands on the cleaning cart. "Everybody makes mistakes." "Not here." There was no pride in his voice. Only quiet certainty. I studied him for a moment before answering. "That sounds exhausting." He looked at me as though I had spoken a language nobody else remembered. The corners of his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You think you understand this place?" he asked. I slowly shook my head. "No. But I understand people. They breathe differently when they are scared." His gaze drifted down the hallway where dozens of polished office doors stood perfectly closed. "And how do I breathe?" The question surprised me. I should have ignored it. Instead, I answered honestly. "Like someone who has forgotten what it feels like to relax." For several long seconds neither of us spoke. The rain continued whispering against the glass while the city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Damien finally looked away first. "You notice more than you should, Claire Bennett." I offered a faint smile as I reached for my mop. "That is probably why I am good at cleaning. The dirt people ignore is usually the dirt that matters most." Without another word, he nodded once and walked toward the private elevator, but just before the doors closed, I caught him looking back at me again, not with suspicion or authority, but with the quiet curiosity of a man who had just discovered the only person in his world willing to tell him the truth. The next evening I expected to return to the ordinary office floors where spilled coffee and forgotten lunches were the biggest problems waiting for me after dark. Instead, my supervisor stopped me before I could clock in and handed me the same silver access badge. "Penthouse again," she said without looking up from her clipboard. "The client specifically requested the same cleaner." I almost laughed because that had never happened before. People remembered accountants, lawyers, and architects. Nobody remembered the cleaning staff. Still, I clipped the badge onto my uniform and rode the elevator back to the highest floor. The hallway looked exactly as I had left it except for one detail. The small crimson stain was gone. Someone had cleaned it before I arrived. I stared at the flawless marble for a second longer than I should have before pushing my cart toward the executive offices. Whoever had removed it had done excellent work. Not a trace remained. Somehow that disappointed me. It felt as though a page had been torn from a book before I had finished reading it. I was dusting the bookshelves inside a private library when another employee entered carrying a large cardboard box filled with expensive glass awards. He could not have been older than 22. His company identification badge swung nervously from his neck while he struggled to balance the weight. "Need a hand?" I asked. "I am fine," he answered too quickly. On his third step the box shifted. 2 crystal awards slid toward the edge. I caught one before it could fall while he barely managed to steady the other. His face turned pale. "Thank you," he whispered. "If those broke, I would probably lose my job." Before I could answer, a sharp voice echoed from the doorway. "Why is this taking so long?" A man in an expensive navy suit stood there checking the time on his watch. Without waiting for an explanation, he frowned at the young employee. "You were given one simple assignment." The young man lowered his eyes immediately. "I am sorry, sir." Something about the apology bothered me. He had almost dropped the awards, but he had not. He had corrected the mistake before any damage was done. I set the crystal trophy carefully onto the shelf and looked at the executive. He was being careful. The room became completely still. The young employee looked horrified that I had spoken at all. The executive turned toward me with visible irritation. "Who asked for your opinion?" "Nobody," I replied calmly. "But if people have to choose between being careful and being fast, I hope they choose careful." His jaw tightened, but before he could respond another voice interrupted from the hallway. "She is correct." Damien stepped into the room with the same quiet confidence that seemed to lower every other voice around him. The executive immediately straightened his posture. "Mr. DeLuca, I was simply trying to maintain efficiency." Damien glanced toward the shelf, then toward the nervous young employee whose hands were still trembling slightly. "Efficiency without respect creates fear," he said evenly. "Fear creates expensive mistakes." The executive nodded once and quietly excused himself. The young employee exhaled so deeply I thought he might collapse from relief. "Thank you, sir," he said before carrying the empty box out of the room. Damien waited until the door closed before looking at me. Most people would have stayed silent. I returned to dusting the shelf. Silence is easy. And speaking? I smiled faintly without lifting my eyes. Speaking costs more. He studied me for a long moment before asking, "Then why keep paying the price?" I placed the final crystal award into perfect alignment and looked at our reflections in the polished glass behind it. "Because respect cannot be bought," I said quietly. "It has to be practiced. Even when nobody important is watching." I expected him to answer immediately. Instead, he remained silent, staring not at the awards, not at the room, but at his own reflection beside mine, as though those simple words had uncovered something wealth had never been able to purchase. The building felt different after that conversation. Nothing had changed on the surface. The marble still reflected every chandelier. The elevators still whispered instead of rattled. The offices still smelled faintly of cedar wood, fresh coffee, and expensive cologne. But once you realized people were hiding behind perfect appearances, you started noticing the cracks no polish could cover. That night my assignment took me farther down the private corridor than ever before. Most of the offices were dark, their glass walls reflecting the city skyline stretching for miles beyond the windows. I moved quietly, emptying wastebaskets, wiping fingerprints from conference tables, straightening chairs that hardly looked touched. It was peaceful until I reached a smaller executive lounge tucked behind the main boardroom. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the lights were off except for the glow of a desk lamp. I assumed someone had forgotten to turn it off after another late meeting. I pushed my cart closer and reached for the switch beside the doorway. Voices stopped me. 2 men were inside speaking so softly I almost mistook them for the hum of the ventilation system. I immediately stepped back, intending to leave without interrupting. Then one sentence drifted through the narrow opening. "He still believes everyone in this building is loyal." The words froze me where I stood. Another voice answered with a quiet laugh. "That is why this works. Nobody questions the people standing closest to him." I felt my heartbeat quicken. I should have walked away. This conversation clearly was not meant for someone pushing a cleaning cart. Instead, I found myself standing perfectly still, not because I wanted answers, but because my feet refused to move. Papers rustled inside the room. Tomorrow's financial reports will reach him exactly as planned. And the real numbers? Already redirected. A long silence followed before the first man spoke again. When everything finally comes apart, he will never know where it started. I swallowed carefully. My father always used to say that lies rarely arrived wearing ugly faces. They usually smiled first. I quietly backed away from the doorway, careful not to let the wheels of my cart squeak against the polished floor. Just as I reached the hallway, one of the office phones rang inside the lounge. Both voices stopped instantly. I did not wait to hear anything else. I turned the corner and continued cleaning as naturally as I could, although my hands suddenly felt much colder than the air around me. For the next 20 minutes I tried convincing myself it was none of my business. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe they were discussing ordinary corporate finances. Maybe there was a perfectly harmless explanation for everything I had overheard. Yet the words refused to leave my mind. He still believes everyone is loyal. The sentence echoed louder with every room I cleaned. As I finished wiping the reception desk outside Damien's private office, I noticed him standing alone near the windows overlooking the city. His jacket rested across one chair while he quietly read a stack of reports beneath a warm desk lamp. The entire floor seemed to revolve around him, yet he looked completely isolated inside the silence. He had no idea that somewhere only a few doors away, trust was being discussed like something that could be traded. I lowered my eyes and gripped the handle of my cleaning cart. I had promised myself years ago never to interfere in other people's lives. It kept things simple. Safe. Predictable. But as I watched the reflection of Damien standing alone in the dark glass, one impossible question settled into my mind. If I stayed silent now, would I become just another person pretending not to notice the mess? My hands kept moving even after my mind had stopped. I emptied trash bins that were already half empty, straightened magazines that nobody had touched, and polished a brass handrail until I could see my own anxious reflection staring back at me. Every ordinary task suddenly felt unfamiliar because one question refused to leave me alone. What if those voices had been telling the truth? I had spent my entire life believing that cleaning was simple. Somebody made a mess. Somebody else cleaned it. Life moved on. But this was different. Some messes could not be wiped away with a cloth. They grew quietly beneath polished surfaces until everything above them eventually cracked. I pushed my cart toward Damien's office 3 different times before turning away each time. What was I supposed to say? Excuse me, I accidentally overheard a conversation that may or may not mean something? I could already imagine the embarrassed silence that would follow. I was a cleaner. He managed an empire. Those worlds were never supposed to meet. I finally reached the large windows overlooking the city and pretended to clean fingerprints from the glass while trying to organize my thoughts. Behind me, Damien quietly signed another document before placing it onto a neat stack. He looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to ever set down. Without looking up, he spoke. You have walked past my office 4 times. I froze with the spray bottle still in my hand. 5, he corrected after a brief glance toward the reflection in the glass. You forgot the first one. A nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it. You count? I notice patterns. I turned slowly. I guess we have that in common. He rested the pen on his desk and folded his hands. Something is bothering you. It was not a question. I stared at the polished wooden floor between us. Can I ask you something? You just did. His dry answer almost made me smile. Do you trust everybody who works for you? The room became perfectly still. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the skyline, illuminating the clouds for only a second before darkness returned. Damien leaned back slightly without taking his eyes off me. No. His answer surprised me. I trust very few people. Then, do you verify important things yourself? He studied me carefully. Not suspiciously. Carefully. Like he was trying to understand what had led me to ask such an unusual question. Why? My heartbeat quickened. This was the moment I had been avoiding all night. Because I think someone expects you not to. Silence settled between us. He did not interrupt. He did not pressure me. He simply waited. So I told him exactly what I had heard, leaving out nothing and adding nothing. I repeated every sentence as accurately as I could remember, careful not to exaggerate or guess at meanings I did not understand. When I finished, Damien remained completely motionless. His expression revealed nothing, but something changed in his eyes. The quiet warmth I had begun to recognize disappeared behind sharp focus. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the rain-soaked city for several long seconds. Finally he spoke. Do you know what most people would have done? I shook my head. They would have ignored it because speaking creates risk. I looked down at my white cleaning gloves. I almost ignored it. He turned back toward me. But you did not. Because if I had stayed quiet and something happened later. I hesitated before finishing the sentence. I would have remembered this night for the rest of my life. He nodded almost imperceptibly. So would I. He pressed a single button on the phone sitting beside his desk. A calm voice answered immediately. Yes, sir? Damien never looked away from me as he spoke. Cancel tomorrow morning's financial review. Move every audit forward to tonight. Personally. There was a brief pause on the other end before the voice answered, immediately, sir. The line disconnected. Damien slipped the phone back onto its cradle and, for the first time since I had met him, his voice carried something deeper than authority. It carried gratitude. You may have just saved me from cleaning up a very expensive mistake. The audit began before sunrise. I did not witness the meetings or the spreadsheets or the endless conversations behind closed doors. I witnessed something much quieter. Faces. The same employees who had walked these halls with effortless confidence only hours earlier now moved with careful steps and lowered voices. Phones rang more often. Doors opened and closed more quickly. Even the air felt tighter, as though the building itself had started holding its breath. I kept cleaning because that was what I knew how to do. Dust still settled on bookshelves. Fingerprints still appeared on polished glass. Coffee still left pale circles on expensive desks. The ordinary world continued even while something invisible shifted beneath it. Around 7 in the morning I finished wiping the reception counter outside Damien's office. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the eastern windows, turning the marble floor gold instead of white. I was replacing fresh flowers in a crystal vase when the private elevator doors opened. 3 senior executives stepped out together. Their expressions were strained, but what caught my attention was what happened next. Damien walked past them without speaking. Instead of leading from the front as everyone expected, he quietly opened the conference room door and waited for the oldest maintenance worker in the building to finish pushing a supply cart through the hallway before entering himself. It lasted only a few seconds. Nobody else seemed to notice. I did. Respect had become a habit he was practicing, one small decision at a time. An hour later I was preparing to leave when one of his assistants approached me carrying a thick cream-colored envelope. Mr. DeLuca asked me to give you this before you left. I accepted it with confused hands. Inside was an elegant card embossed with silver lettering. It contained an offer for a full-time position on Damien's private household staff, along with a salary that was nearly 3 times what I currently earned. Housing, benefits, transportation, everything had already been arranged. For a long moment I simply stared at the paper. The numbers almost looked unreal. They represented freedom from overdue rent, from second jobs, from counting every dollar before grocery shopping. The assistant smiled politely. You would report directly to Mr. DeLuca. He believes you would be appreciated. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. May I return something with it? The assistant blinked. Of course. I borrowed a pen from the reception desk and wrote only one sentence across the blank card tucked inside. Thank you, but my honesty is not for sale. I sealed the envelope again and handed it back. The assistant looked genuinely surprised. Are you certain? Very. Most people would accept without thinking. I smiled softly. That is probably why someone should think before accepting. He nodded uncertainly before disappearing into Damien's office. I gathered my cleaning supplies and stepped into the elevator feeling lighter than I had in days. The money would have changed my life, but something inside me would have changed too, and I was not sure I would recognize the person looking back from the mirror afterward. Just as the elevator doors began closing, a familiar voice echoed across the hallway. Claire. I pressed the open button. Damien stood outside his office holding the same envelope in one hand. There was no disappointment on his face. Only quiet understanding. Why? He asked. I looked at the polished marble stretching between us before answering. Because if I start working for you instead of with my principles, one day I will stop knowing the difference. He remained silent for several seconds before giving a slow nod. Very few people have ever said no to me. I offered a faint smile as the elevator doors prepared to close again. Maybe that is why somebody should. As the elevator carried me toward the lobby, I caught one final glimpse of him standing alone beneath the morning light, still holding the rejected envelope, wearing the thoughtful expression of a man who had just discovered that the rarest thing in his world was not loyalty, wealth, or influence, but someone who valued their conscience more than opportunity. The following week the building settled into a strange new rhythm. The polished hallways looked exactly the same, yet the people walking through them did not. Conversations became shorter. Meetings ended earlier. Smiles looked more genuine instead of carefully rehearsed. Whatever Damien had uncovered during that overnight audit remained private, but the atmosphere told its own story. Someone had quietly disappeared from the executive floor. Someone else had taken over the financial office. Nobody explained anything, and I never asked. My job had always been to notice, not to pry. Late one Thursday evening I was wiping fingerprints from the enormous windows outside Damien's office when I realized the lights inside were still on. It was almost 11. Every other executive had already gone home. I glanced through the glass and found him standing alone beside a bookshelf instead of sitting behind his desk. His tie had been loosened. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms. A single lamp illuminated the room while the rest remained in soft shadow. He looked less like the man who commanded an empire and more like someone who had forgotten there was a world outside his office. Before I could quietly move on, the office door opened. "You are still here," he said. "So are you," I answered. He gave a faint smile. "Fair enough." I hesitated before stepping inside with my cleaning cart. The office was unusually untidy. Several books lay open across the coffee table. Empty coffee cups rested beside handwritten notes. One chair had been pulled away from the conference table as though someone had started a conversation that never finished. I began gathering the cups while Damien remained by the window watching the rain drift across the skyline. "Do you ever go home?" I asked before realizing how personal the question sounded. He surprised me by answering anyway. "Sometimes." I looked around the room. "This does not look like sometimes." He let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You notice everything." "Only because everything tells a story." He turned toward me. "Then what story does this room tell?" I looked at the scattered papers, the untouched dinner tray sitting cold on a side table, and the jacket folded over the back of a chair instead of hanging in the closet. Finally I answered. "It tells me everyone depends on you." He waited. "But nobody asks whether you are tired." His expression changed so subtly that another person might have missed it. His shoulders relaxed just enough for me to realize how much tension they had been carrying. People expect certainty, he said quietly. Leaders are not supposed to look exhausted. I folded the napkin from the untouched dinner tray before placing it neatly beside the plate. Maybe leaders are also people. Silence settled gently between us. Outside, headlights drifted through the rain far below like tiny stars moving across dark water. Damien picked up one of the books from the table and absent-mindedly closed it. When I was 24, someone told me that if I wanted others to feel safe, I could never appear uncertain. He smiled without humor. I believed it. And now? He looked around the office that had become almost impossibly quiet. Now I am not sure whether they feel safe or simply afraid to disappoint me. I placed the final coffee cup onto my cart and wiped the table clean until the wood reflected the lamp above it. There is a difference. I know. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. I am only beginning to learn it. As I reached the door, I noticed a framed family photograph sitting alone on a shelf behind his desk. An older couple smiled warmly beside a much younger Damien wearing a baseball cap instead of an expensive suit. Dust had settled lightly across the frame while every award in the office gleamed perfectly. Without saying a word, I polished the glass and returned the picture to exactly the same place. When I looked back, Damien was watching me with an expression I could not quite read. You cleaned the only thing I forgot I still had, he said quietly. I smiled gently. Sometimes the things that matter most collect dust because they are too close to our hearts to notice. 2 nights later I found a handwritten note resting on top of my cleaning cart before my shift even began. It was not folded inside an expensive envelope this time. It was written on an ordinary sheet of white paper in careful, deliberate handwriting. Claire. Coffee. 10 minutes. Conference room 3. No signature was necessary. I smiled despite myself. It felt less like an invitation from the most powerful man in the building and more like a request from someone learning that conversations could happen without commands. I finished organizing my supplies before walking toward the conference room. Damien was already there. 2 steaming cups of coffee rested on the polished walnut table beside a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery instead of an expensive restaurant. He noticed me looking at it. The woman behind the counter insisted these are the best blueberry muffins in Manhattan. I sat across from him with a quiet laugh. You trusted her? She seemed very confident. That does not necessarily mean she was right. I am beginning to learn that. His answer carried enough humor that I smiled before taking a sip of coffee. For several moments neither of us spoke. We simply watched the rain drift across the windows while the city slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Finally Damien broke the silence. The audit confirmed everything you overheard. I looked down at my cup. I am sorry. He tilted his head slightly. Why are you apologizing? Because discovering someone has betrayed your trust cannot feel good. He remained quiet for a long moment before nodding. No. It does not. He stared into his coffee as though searching for an answer floating somewhere beneath the surface. Do you know what surprised me most? I shook my head. Not the dishonesty. That happens everywhere. What surprised me was how many honest people had simply stopped speaking because they believed nobody would listen. His words lingered between us. They reminded me of dusty picture frames and untouched dinners. Rooms did not become neglected overnight. They became neglected one small decision at a time. I looked toward the conference table where every chair now sat perfectly aligned. People usually stop talking after they believe it makes no difference. He nodded slowly. And I gave them that reason. His admission caught me completely off guard. It was simple. Quiet. Honest. No excuses. No explanations. Just responsibility. I rested both hands around the warm coffee cup. That is difficult to admit. It is necessary. He looked directly at me for the first time that morning. There is something else I need to say. The room seemed to grow even quieter. When we first met, I assumed you were simply another employee passing through my building. He paused before continuing. I never considered how often people like you are overlooked. I smiled gently. Most cleaners get used to being invisible. They should not have to. He inhaled slowly before speaking the two words that seemed almost unfamiliar to him. I am sorry. The apology settled into the room with unexpected weight. There was nothing dramatic about it. No audience. No celebration. Just one man choosing humility over pride. I could see that saying those words had cost him something, perhaps years of believing powerful people never admitted fault. I answered with the only truth that came to mind. Then do not stop with me. His eyebrows lifted slightly. What do you mean? I glanced toward the hallway where employees would soon begin arriving for another busy day. If you really mean those words, let everyone else hear them through the way you lead. Damien looked toward the closed conference room door as though imagining the people beyond it. Then a slow smile appeared, not confident, not rehearsed, but quietly grateful. You continue giving me the most expensive advice I have ever received. I stood, gathered the empty coffee cups, and placed them carefully onto my cart. Good advice is free, I said as I reached the doorway. Living by it is the part that costs everything. Behind me, the room remained silent, but somehow it no longer felt empty. The changes became impossible to ignore after that morning. It started with small things that most people would have dismissed as coincidence. Damien began arriving early enough to greet the reception staff by name. Executive meetings no longer began until every participant had reached the room instead of locking the doors exactly on the hour. Security guards who had once stood stiffly against the walls were suddenly offered fresh coffee during overnight shifts. None of these decisions appeared in company newsletters. Nobody made speeches about them. They simply happened, one quiet act of respect at a time. The building itself seemed to breathe easier. I noticed people smiling in elevators instead of staring silently at the floor. The young assistant who had once dropped an armful of papers now walked through the hallways with confidence instead of fear. Even the oldest maintenance worker laughed more often while repairing lights that had flickered for months. Respect, I realized, spread through a place much faster than authority ever could. Not everyone welcomed the changes. One rainy evening, as I finished polishing the brass rail outside the executive conference room, several well-dressed board members walked past without noticing me. Their conversation was quiet, but not quiet enough. He has become distracted, one man muttered. Another answered with obvious frustration. He spends too much time listening to people who should simply follow instructions. A third voice spoke with sharp certainty. Leadership requires distance. Familiarity weakens authority. I lowered my eyes and continued wiping the rail as though I had heard nothing at all. The men disappeared into the conference room where Damien was already waiting. Nearly 2 hours passed before the doors finally opened again. The board members emerged first. None of them looked pleased. Their polished shoes echoed across the marble while the hallway returned to silence. Damien stepped out last. He looked tired, but there was something steadier about him than when we had first met. He noticed me replacing fresh flowers in a crystal arrangement near the entrance. Long meeting? I asked. He smiled faintly. Long opinions. I adjusted one white lily that had begun leaning toward the edge of the vase. Flowers do that too. He looked at the arrangement curiously. Do what? They all try to reach the light from different directions. I gently turned the vase a few inches so every bloom faced the windows equally. Sometimes they only need someone to move the vase instead of blaming the flowers. His quiet laugh returned, warmer than before. Then his expression grew thoughtful. Some members of the board believe I have changed too much. I met his eyes. Have you? He looked around the hallway where employees passed without lowering their heads the way they once had. A receptionist waved good night from across the lobby. Damien smiled and waved back without hesitation. Yes, he answered honestly. Then perhaps that is exactly the right amount. We stood together for a moment watching the rain streak across the glass. Finally he spoke again. They believe I am becoming weaker. I looked toward the polished marble stretching beneath our feet, remembering the first stain I had found there weeks earlier. People often confuse kindness with weakness because they have never needed courage to be kind. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual before he slowly nodded. I used to believe strength meant standing above everyone else. And now? A peaceful silence settled between us before he answered. Now I think real strength might be helping other people stand beside you. Somewhere down the hallway the maintenance worker laughed at something a security guard had said. The sound echoed softly through the building, ordinary and genuine. Damien listened to it with the faintest smile. For the first time since I had known him, the tallest man in the building no longer seemed like the loneliest. Autumn arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, until the trees lining the avenue below the tower exchanged their deep green leaves for shades of gold and amber. I realized nearly 2 months had passed since the night I first stepped onto the penthouse floor with nothing more than a mop, a bucket, and the expectation of another ordinary shift. Almost nothing about my job description had changed. I still emptied trash bins. I still polished marble until it reflected the ceiling lights like calm water. I still worked while the rest of the city slept. Yet everything around me felt different because the people inside the building had begun treating one another differently. One evening I arrived to find the executive dining room unusually quiet. Instead of the usual dozen place settings prepared for another late meeting, only one table remained arranged near the windows overlooking Manhattan. A simple dinner rested beneath warm lights. Nothing extravagant. Fresh bread. Soup. Grilled salmon. A small vase holding white lilies. Damien stood beside the table waiting as though he had been there for some time. You planned this? I asked with genuine surprise. He nodded. I wanted to thank the person who reminded me that conversations should not always happen across a desk. I looked toward my cleaning cart. I am still working. So am I. The answer made me smile. We sat across from one another while the city glowed beneath the evening sky. The meal was quiet, comfortable, interrupted only by occasional laughter that neither of us seemed to expect. He asked about my childhood in Ohio, about my father who believed honest work gave people dignity, about why I never stopped smiling even after long overnight shifts. I asked him about the baseball cap in the family photograph, about the little neighborhood where he grew up before the expensive suits and boardrooms, about whether he ever missed the version of himself who had time to watch sunsets instead of financial reports. Every day, he admitted softly. The honesty in his voice felt heavier than any confession I had heard before. When dinner ended, I automatically gathered the empty plates. Damien reached for them at the same moment. Allow me. I looked at him in surprise. You do not have to do that. Neither do you. Before I could protest, he carried the dishes to the small kitchenette himself. Watching the most powerful man I had ever met rinse 2 coffee cups beneath warm running water somehow felt more extraordinary than every luxury surrounding us. He dried his hands with a towel before turning back toward me. The board met again this afternoon. His voice remained calm, but I sensed the weight behind the words. They offered me a choice. I waited quietly. Return to the old way of leading. He paused, looking toward the lights stretching across the city. Or accept that some of them will leave. What did you choose? He smiled gently, not with triumph but with peace. People who only stay because they fear change were never truly standing beside me. I felt something warm settle quietly inside my chest. It was not pride. It was relief. He had finally stopped measuring success by who obeyed him and started measuring it by who believed in him. As I picked up my cleaning cart to leave, Damien stepped into the hallway beside me. For a brief moment we simply stood there watching employees finish another ordinary workday. A receptionist laughed with a security guard. An accountant held the elevator so a janitor could step inside first. Tiny moments. Easy to miss unless you knew what the building had once been. Damien looked at those simple acts before speaking almost to himself. I spent years trying to build an empire. Then he looked at me. You helped me build something much harder. I tilted my head. What is that? His answer came without hesitation. A place where people no longer feel small just because I happen to stand in the room. Winter arrived with the first quiet snowfall of the season, covering the sidewalks below in white and softening the sharp edges of the city I had crossed every night for years. I stood beside the same floor-to-ceiling windows where this story had truly begun, moving my cloth across the glass until Manhattan looked crystal clear again. My reflection appeared beside the skyline, still wearing the same navy cleaning uniform, still carrying the same supply cart, still doing the same honest work my father had always respected. Some things had never changed, and somehow that felt more valuable than ever. Behind me the private elevator doors opened. I did not have to turn around to know it was Damien. His footsteps had changed over the past months. They were no longer measured by urgency alone. They carried something lighter now, something that sounded almost like peace. He stopped beside the window without speaking. Together we watched snowflakes drift slowly between the towers as employees below hurried home with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks. Do you remember the first night we met? He asked quietly. I smiled without taking my eyes off the city. You told me not to clean a stain. He nodded. I thought leaving it there would remind me of one difficult evening. He paused before continuing. I never imagined it would remind me of the person who changed everything afterward. I laughed softly. I did not change anything. You are still doing it. He gestured toward the hallway behind us. Receptionists were laughing together while leaving for the evening. A maintenance worker accepted a grateful handshake from one of the senior executives. Security officers exchanged warm goodnights with accountants who only months earlier had hurried past them without making eye contact. The building no longer felt like a monument to power. It felt like a place where people belonged. You reminded me that leadership is not measured by how many people stand when you enter a room, Damien said. It is measured by how many people feel seen after you leave it. His words settled gently into the quiet between us. I looked down at my cleaning cart before answering. I only cleaned what everyone else overlooked. Exactly. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small silver key card. This gives you permanent access to every floor in the building. I looked at it without reaching for it. I already have an access badge. This is different. He smiled. Not because it opens more doors, but because it means this place will always be yours if you choose to stay. I accepted the card slowly, understanding that it was never about privilege. It was about trust. I slipped it carefully into my pocket beside the pair of white cleaning gloves I still carried every night. They had become a reminder that dignity never depended on a title. Before leaving, I walked one final time through the executive hallway, straightened a chair that had shifted only an inch, adjusted a picture frame hanging slightly crooked, and polished the brass rail until it reflected the warm evening lights. The building was already clean. I simply wanted to leave it a little better than I had found it. As I returned to the windows, Damien was still standing there watching the snow fall across the city. What are you thinking about? He asked. I smiled at the endless lights stretching beyond the glass. That marble floors always shine brightest after someone is willing to kneel and care for them. He nodded thoughtfully. Neither of us spoke again. We did not have to. Some stories end with crowns, fortunes, or applause. Ours ended with something quieter. A man discovered that respect could never be commanded. A cleaner discovered that kindness could reach places power never could. And every time I pushed my cart across those polished floors afterward, I remembered the simplest truth I had ever learned. The strongest people are not the ones who stand above everyone else. They are the ones who make everyone around them stand a little taller.